Hopefully all of you got online and got a copy of the syllabus. If not, then we can make some other arrangements for you to get a copy of that. It explains to you briefly what I envision this class on church history to be about. As you well know, Victor is not in a position or condition to be teaching this class this term, and so I found out last Sunday afternoon that I was going to be teaching it. I have taught church history before, about 30-something years ago. And in fact, I've taught it a number of times, but the last time in a classroom situation of this kind was more than 30 years ago. But I've taught it a number of times in the congregations that I've been a part of. I've been a student of church history ever since I was in a seat like you're in now. And I took for the very first time a course on church history. That was at Florida Christian College. And it opened up to me the opportunity to spend a part of my life as a student of God's Word, also to be a student of the history of Christianity and of the church. And so I've made that one of my goals on a regular basis to keep revisiting various aspects of that. My church could tell you that almost any message I deliver there is going to have several things in it. One, it's going to have at least one Greek word study. Might only be 1 minute long, but we'll have it. There's going to be some history in it, biblical history or world history that relates to it, and there probably will be something out of the history of Christianity that will relate to that topic as well, in almost every sermon I preach. And so it's very much a topic I'm in love with. And I hope that I, if not inspire you to be in love with it, at least to appreciate it and see the value that it has for you. Our textbook is going to not be the one that Victor has commonly used. There's I'm not quite sure what's the kindest way to say this. There's a tendency on the part of us who teach subjects to use the same textbook we were taught with. And I'm almost certain that Victor was taught through Brother Maddox's book on the eternal kingdom. And it's a great book, but I'll explain in a few moments why we won't be using it as our primary textbook. Instead, I'm going with another one written more recently called Christian History Made Easy. They're on order at the bookstore. We think they will be in by the end of this week. And at the same time, I need for you to realize that while you are to read it entirely through and take notes on it, as you can see in the syllabus, that we will not primarily be just in this book in the way of just, well, this week we're in chapter 1, next week we're in chapter 2, the next week we're in chapter 3. We will be using material out of this book along with a lot of other materials, but this is a book that presents, as most books on church history do, the traditional way of teaching church history, which is starting somewhere around 0 AD and ending somewhere around 2017 AD, and doing it in a very linear fashion. We're not going to do it that way, but hopefully you will appreciate the way we will be doing it. Okay. Why not this one? This is a recommended text. If you only bought 2 other books on church history besides our textbook, this would be one of the 2 I'd recommend. But the reason is the perspective from which it is written. And that again, that's not critic. That's just explanation. Brother Maddox, a gospel preacher, Bible scholar, I believe former president of Lubbock Christian College, wrote this book for members of the Churches of Christ to understand the concept of New Testament Christianity and restoring New Testament Christianity, and that is what shaped everything he wrote in the book. And that's not a bad thing. I think we need to know that, and if we're going to know our own history, we must know that. But I wanted a little broader perspective than that. I wanted a book that that taught church history more from what is often referred to as Western evangelical Christianity. That's a little bit broader standpoint than just us. And yet it still very much is what we are actually a part of from a scholarly standpoint. And so that's why I chose this, Christian History Made Easy. I feel like it's an easy read, a lot of information in there besides just the main timeline approach to it, and a lot of things that will be useful to us. And we'll have more to say about those things as the course goes on. All right. We've got our roll just about finished. Explanation to you about part of the syllabus. When you get down to the very end, you see how your grade is going to be determined on 4 things. First of all, a notebook made up of 2 parts. Your notes that you take in this class and notes you take as you read through your textbook. I don't expect the notes on the textbook to be exhaustive, but you should be able to capture the main idea and the main points of each chapter. Probably, if we're talking in page numbers, probably at least 4 pages per chapter I would expect in your final notes. But beyond that, there is going to be a research paper / presentation, and there'll be more to be explained about that. There is a short paragraph on it already just above where it talks about your grades. We'll probably be talking about it quite a bit more next class session on Thursday. And then pop quizzes. You're going to have a pop test every single class period. In fact, you're about to have one in just about 2 minutes. I know you say you haven't even learned anything yet, but that's okay. The first one you automatically get 100 on if you just do it. But that may not necessarily be so about the following ones. Each pop test will ask 4 or 5 questions that were covered in the class period before that one. And so you'll take that pop test. Each pop test will count 1 point of your final grade. So if you ace every one of them, that's a total of 15 points for this class just from the pop test. And then we will have a final exam at the end. There will be no other test during the course of this study together. Okay, any questions about that? I'll be happy to elaborate what I can. You do need to realize I'm making this up as I go along too. This is the first time for you, and it's the first time in a long time for me. I didn't have any of this material prepared a week ago, so I know some have already asked, can you give me your notes for the course? I don't even know yet what I'm going to say Thursday, so much less have typed them up. But as quickly as I get them done, well, then you'll be hearing about it in class. So, yes, sir.
On the summary that you've got from the book that we're reading, can it be typed up?
Yes. As far as your notebook is concerned, I don't know what the requirements of other instructors are, or even of Mr. Terry, and I don't want to go contrary to what Mr. Terry says should be done, but it's fine with me if your notebooks are handwritten. And I feel like that saves you time. If you feel more comfortable typing than writing, great. But if you're writing it first, then turning around and typing it, in case of your notebooks, handwritten is fine with me. After I get through looking at it at the end of the term, I'm handing it back to you anyway, and then I'll never see it again. And you probably 35 years from now will still be looking at it from time to time. So, okay. Yes, sir.
Will our pop quizzes, do we use that to create like our study guide for the final? So like the questions, will they be the same?
I would say it would cover the same things, but not necessarily limited to those things. So that's probably not helpful. The pop test is, from my perspective, a way of saying these are the most important things I feel like we talked about last time. Did you get that? And that's what it's intended. They will not be long form. They probably will be true, false, yes, no's, fill in the blanks, kind of thing. So they can just be done in just 3 or 4 minutes here in class at the beginning of each time, and then we can get into what we're here for that day. So, yes, ma'am.
So, what's been happening so far is that women haven't had to do the presentation.
Right. No, I think I I should have said that there at least, that the ladies, you're not going to be asked to stand up before the group and speak. However, if you did it on something I felt like the class would really benefit from, and you'd be willing, we might ask, in your case, your husband, or we might, if others, it might be someone else in the class would be willing to stand up and read your presentation before the class if I feel like it's got great, would have value at that particular point in our class. Because these are going to be being presented starting week after next in class. And so you're going to find out on Thursday what yours is about. And not everyone's going to have the same one. And so by week after next, I'm going to start calling on folks, the men particularly, to take 10 minutes and present their presentation. Or in some cases, if appropriate, one of the ladies' presentations, if the whole class might benefit from that. And if we feel like these are good enough for you, I'm even thinking that at the end of this course that we may take all of those and we will print them all up and bind them into a book form for everyone to have. I think you'll find it a valuable part of your ongoing resources. All right.
I'm sorry, Richard, did
Yes.
you say when the notes on each chapter and the ultimate, the project that you were just talking about, did you say when they were due?
They will be turned in the same day we take our final.
Okay.
You'll turn in your notes and so forth on the same day that our final is scheduled. Okay? Thanks for asking that. That's a good question. All right. Here's your pop test. Let's see how we can pass these out. Make sure I give enough for everybody. I think that should be enough for your section, enough hopefully for your section. Maybe I'll give you a couple of more there. And then if you'd pass that out.
Y'all want one, or? Sure. Yeah, good people. Ready? Chris?
I don't got it.
What if we just end up with one check?
You're not going to be graded on how many checks you have. You're going to be graded on whether or not you did it at all. If you do it at all today, then you made 100 on this pop test.
That's how long we're gonna be?
They're not all going to work that way. Okay, if you feel comfortable for it, if you just pass it to the center aisle so we have someone pick those up and get them back to me. Thank you. I just want to put them over there with the others. Thank you.
Yeah, I was hoping you'd leave it on top, but you didn't see it.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay, that'll be fine too.
Are you comfortable with Richard or maybe?
Yes, I am very comfortable being called Richard. I've been called that all my life, and I didn't suddenly get uncomfortable with it.
What about Richie? What are your feelings?
Well, the last time I was called that, I was about 4 years old by my great-grandfather, and then he passed away. So I don't think there's any connection between those two, but... and I have been called a few other things, not all of which I wish to tell you about, but... Okay, what is the point of this pop quiz? The point is this, that we probably don't know very much about it. I haven't looked at your papers yet to see who checked what, but all of those things mentioned on there, the dates, the people, the events, and hundreds more that some will and some won't be able to talk about, are all very important in church history. Tell you a little bit about them. Jerome, he translated the New Testament into the Latin language, the language of the people, around AD 400. And it caused such a stir in the churches that less than 100 years later, the church had banned people from getting it. Now that they could actually read it in their own language, because by that period of time, Greek was not the language of the Roman Empire, Latin was. Polycarp, early church father. You'll learn what that means if you don't know already. And one of the most famous of the martyrs of the 2nd century. Gregory the Great, the first bishop of Rome that was universally called the Pope in 604. The Great Schism. That is when the Roman Catholic Church, the Western Church, and the Eastern Church, called the Orthodox Church, officially divided into two separate entities around in the early 1000s. I want to say 1054, but my mind is probably playing a trick on me at the moment. But it's shortly after AD 1000. It's called the Great Schism. They'd been growing apart for hundreds of years, but finally they recognized officially at this point called the Great Schism that they were no longer the same fellowship and haven't been since. The Great Awakening, an event primarily in American history before the Revolutionary War, in which there was this great spiritual awakening that took place in the United States, which wasn't even the United States yet, it was just the colonies. And so you had these great preachers who were preaching messages like sinners in the hand of an angry God, and messages like this, and people repenting and turning back to God. It was followed less than 100 years later by a second Great Awakening, and then about 75 years after that, a third awakening that happened in the very early years of the 20th century in America. It's time for another one. We're on schedule, if you look at when those took place, to have another one. The diet of worms. This is not what Martin Luther ate. This was the meeting with the Catholic Church he had in which they officially declared him a heretic. And not only banned him from the Catholic Church, he eventually put out an order for his death. Worms was a place, I believe, in France. Cane Ridge Revival, an event that happened in the early 1800s, about 1804, I believe it is, in Cane Ridge, Kentucky, in a small area. Only about 12,000 people lived in a very large county there, and yet there was a church building. I don't even remember whether it was Presbyterian or Baptist, but it was announced that they were going to have a revival meeting. At the end of that, they would have the Lord's Supper. This was a practice denominations had in the early days of our country. They would only practice sometimes communion once a year. In many communities, there weren't any churches at all, so no people would come together for these revival meetings and then have communion together. But this one turned out to be different. Some 28, I believe it was, different preachers from different religious groups, Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodist, all participated, and for initially about a week to 10 days had end-to-end preaching from early in the morning till late at night, just continuously, and a great revival broke out. Eventually, parts of it continued for months after that in that same location. And at the end of that time, one of the preachers, talking with some others, says, what are we going to do with all these people who have been converted to Christ? They're not Baptists, because it wasn't necessarily a Baptist they heard preach it. They're not Presbyterians, they're not Methodists. And so this was one of the places at that time the whole idea of just being simply Christians broke out again. And it was part of the beginning of what we call the Restoration movement that we are a part of today. One of those preachers was a man by the name of Barton W. Stone. And he took some of those people that were baptized there, and they started a fellowship that was not denominated. They just identified themselves as Christians. And I believe they were the first to actually call themselves a Church of Christ. AD 325. That's when the first church council met. From our perspective, whether for good or for bad, the Council of Nicaea. And out of that came what is called the Nicene Creed, the earliest, almost universally recognized statement of what the Christian faith is fundamentally all about. It came about as a result of heresies concerning the nature of Jesus Christ. Was he a man? Was he God? Was he both? Was he neither? And the church was being torn apart throughout the Roman Empire at that time by these various heresies, and this council took place to try to bring some unity among the leadership of the church about it. That was the Council of Nicaea, AD 325. AD 1454, the year Gutenberg's Bible was printed. Printing press was only invented like 3 or 4 years before that by him. And he printed some other shorter things, getting his skill set down before he finally launched on this more ambitious than I could ever imagine task of actually printing the Bible. And the first edition came out, the Gutenberg Bible, in AD 1454. AD 1832.
What?
AD 1832. The year when the movement that Barton W. Stone had started, and another movement further up north in Illinois and Indiana and so forth, and Pennsylvania, that a father and son named Campbell, Thomas and Alexander Campbell, had started. In 1832, the two groups met together, at least their leaders, in Louisville, Kentucky. And at the end of a week-long meeting together, the leader from one side stepped across the stage and put out his hand to the other side, and in effect said, "We're brethren." And they shook hands, and two different movements became one. And from that point forward, it was called the Stone-Campbell movement, not necessarily by them, but by historians. And so you may have known most of those, a few of those, or none of those. I hope by the time we finish, about 9 weeks from now, that at least they'll sound more familiar to you, along with a lot of other things. All right. Let me cover some introductory comments and so forth here. There's a cartoon came out many years ago by Charles Schulz and the Peanuts. Perhaps you've seen it, perhaps not. It's a favorite of those who teach church history because I guess it's Lucy. I don't remember for sure which one of them it was. I know Peanut, Charlie Brown is looking over her shoulder and she's writing on a piece of paper, church history. She's got to write a school paper. Then she writes down, the history of the church began a long time ago. Our pastor was born in 1930. Most people in most churches, most Christian churches, if they know anything at all about church history, it probably is related to whatever group they're a part of, or maybe even just what congregation they're a part of. And for some of them, they may think history began when they became a part of that group, when they confessed Christ and became a part of that group, and know nothing between the end of the New Testament and that point in time. And that's not unique to us, therefore, if you're in that category. And yet 1/3 of the world's population roughly professes some form or another of Christianity and are all tied together by large amounts of common history, whether it is Roman Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, Anglican, or innumerable smaller groups that don't neatly fit into any one of those categories. So where did they all come from? How are they alike? How do they differ? Why do they even exist? How did the beginning we know about in the New Testament, starting on the day of Pentecost, or even earlier with the ministry of Jesus, how did that turn into what we see today? Well, obviously it didn't happen overnight. It took 2,000 years. And that's what we hope to at least briefly survey during this time, and then to take lots of time to visit special parts of that to learn more about it. As one of the historians said, one of the writers in one of my books on church history, he said, you could certainly go read lots and lots of books on church history to find the answers to that. But then if you did that, you would be a scholar like I am. But that's not for most people. And so usually just a single survey course is at least enough to introduce us to the topic without being overwhelmed by how much information there is, because there is a lot of information. 2,000 years of events, people, meetings, documents, all sorts of things. And we struggle, and we will struggle to know what do we pick out that's the most significant, and what can we skip past, even though it was important, especially to the people it happened to. And yet, perhaps we don't need to cover that to get the bigger picture. I went to the online dictionary for Merriam-Webster, and I've looked at several other dictionaries, and they all sort of have somewhat the same definition of history. But Merriam-Webster says history is a chronological record of significant events, often including an explanation of their causes. And most historians will tell you the same thing, that history is not just the events, it's also the explanation. But then there's challenges with that. As the definition said, a chronological record of significant events. Chronological is not usually difficult. We can figure out whether it happened in AD 100 or AD 900. But what is challenging is, how do you define or determine significant? Because what you will discover, and this again ties back to what I was saying with Brother Maddox's book on the eternal kingdom, what he lists in there as significant, as for what his purpose was in writing his book, would not necessarily be considered significant for someone else, some other historian writing another church history from a different perspective. I can give you a good example of that. I've seen some church history books that devote no more than one paragraph to what we call the Restoration Movement. That's involved millions of people over 200 years now in America, and yet in many church history books, it's fortunate if it gets one paragraph. That doesn't mean it was insignificant. It just means to that author it seemed not significant enough to devote more time and attention to. And so we have to sort of determine that, and that's not easy to do. You know, everybody's opinion is a little different on it. And then the second part is where it says, often including an explanation of the causes. The explanation is also sometimes up for grabs. One person's idea of why it happened, or even how it happened, or even the consequences of it happening, might be very different from another scholar, or in our case, student of the Word of God. But that should not deter us from wading in all the same. As I've said, I've been doing this for at least 47 years. I took my first class in church history 47 years ago. And so I've been trying to weigh it all out and understand it ever since. So why study church history? That's a common thing that's addressed at the beginning of classes like this. And almost every book will have their own reasons. Our author here, which you don't have access to yet, does that in his introductory part. His is rather brief, I think maybe only a paragraph or so, and that's fine. I like the little bit more detailed one in one of Everett Ferguson's books. You should get to know about Brother Ferguson. He is, scholar emeritus. Is that what they call it? No, distinguished scholar, I believe is his term right now, down at Abilene Christian University. But for years and years, he taught church history and Greek at Abilene Christian University. He's the author of many highly praised and recognized books on different aspects of church history. This is just a little study guide he did a long time ago for the ACU Press. And I guess because he knew he would just be writing to ordinary church members, he took the time at the beginning to talk about why study church history. So I'll give you just a little bit of what he says there. Number one, for confirmation and explanation of the New Testament. What he means by that is in at least the first couple of centuries after the New Testament, if we want to see how those early people took what the New Testament said and tried to put it into practice and into belief, you have to study church history. You know, and again, realize he's a part of the Restoration movement, so he's just as committed as we are to being the New Testament church. And so we say, well, we're just going to skip everything from today back to AD 70 and earlier, except for the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation. It might go up into the 80s or 90s, but we're going to at least skip everything back to the first century, and we just want to do what it says there. Do you reckon there might be some value in seeing how others who tried to do the same thing turned out? Church history helps you see that. That's one value of it. Number two, for demonstration of departure from the New Testament church. Along with seeing how they tried to do it, you will see how the departures took place. Number three, we've already talked about this a little bit, for help in understanding today's religious world. For help in understanding today's religious world. Number four, to learn how others solved or failed to solve similar problems to ours. How do you deal with doctrinal differences? How do you deal with persecution? How do you deal with all sorts of issues that have been dealt with numerous times throughout the history of Christianity, and some of which we're trying to deal with today? Some of them at just the local congregational level, and some as a whole brotherhood of believers. So church history helps us see how others tried to solve those problems, or sometimes how they didn't, and what happened as a result of that. For help, he says, number five, in distinguishing the eternal from the cultural. And what he means by that is see how others sought to try to sort out what's in the New Testament really is of eternal consequence and was intended for Christians in every generation to be doing, as opposed to that they might have recognized or thought they recognized just being cultural. Any of you who've ever tried to struggle with the woman's head covering in 1 Corinthians, point in fact, is that cultural? Is that eternal? All sorts of other issues that have come through the church. Number 6, for examples of noble lives. Brother Ferguson, being a scholar, uses bigger words than I do, and although noble is not all that big a word, it's a big word in meaning, and so I almost never use it myself. But noble, and that is highly respectable, dignified, worthy of imitation. In church history, we find many men and women, and sometimes whole groups of people, worthy of that title of nobility. Number 7, for greater understanding and deeper sympathy. I think that's one I really relate to as well, that it certainly helps us understand that what we're about as trying to restore the New Testament church is sometimes not as simplistic as it may seem. So simple. That there's more challenge to it and there's more difficulty. But it also helps us understand how other groups who had the same goals perhaps that we do turned out a little different, or maybe very different than we did. But also deeper sympathy. Perhaps sometimes we need to understand why people ended up making the decisions they did, which led to them turning out the way they did. And understanding what was going on at the time and what they were trying to deal with helps us. And perhaps we would be quite as judgmental about that. Doesn't necessarily mean we agree that they were right. At least we might understand. There's a case that happens during the persecution of the church in the 200s, in which persecution was so severe there was a significant number of believers in the 200s, the 3rd century, who actually broke down and submitted to the dictates of the Roman government at that time of making a little incense offering to the genius of the emperor and getting a little piece of paper basically that said that they had done this. Well, many others didn't do that. Some of them died as a result. And after the persecution was over, the church struggled with, what do we do with these people? Now they want to come back. They're confessing that they sin. They want to come back. The church struggled for a long time with what to do with these people who had actually failed to stand up when it counted, even at the possible cost to their lives. Well, I think we can empathize both with the church struggling to deal with that, but maybe we can even come to understand what these people who out of fear, gave in at that moment, even though after it was over, that was not going to be their way of life. They wanted to be Christians. They wanted to be right with God. But what happened then? You'll have to wait to find out what happened. And we could read a list from others too about it. Here's my thoughts. And it's not worth even as much as Brother Ferguson's is about this, but the reasons I think of for myself that I have loved to keep on studying church history. Number 1, for knowledge. So I won't be ignorant. Sometimes we may believe certain things or even say certain things to others and even teach others things ignorantly, not realizing that's not accurate. That's not the way it actually happened. And it might have to do with some aspects of the Roman Catholic Church. It might have to do with Orthodoxy. It might have Protestantism. It might even be something within the churches of Christ. So one thing that church history does is gradually dispels ignorance in me. And along with that comes understanding, because knowledge is the foundation for understanding. And then along with understanding, hopefully, wisdom. Dealing with things more, not just accurately, but more fairly and more in the way that would be pleasing to our Lord. The wisdom that can come from that. Church history produces humility in me. I can't honestly say, I'd like to think I could say what I would have done during that persecution I mentioned to you a while ago, but I can't honestly say that because I haven't lived through it yet. It'd be very easy to be filled with pride and say, well, I would never do that. I would never break under pressure. I would die before I renounce my faith just to save my life or the life of members of my family, which many of them were put in that position to do. Church history should teach us humility, to think, I just pray that I would be strong enough to do that. And maybe I can understand a little bit better why some of them were not able to. Courage. Realize I'm not the first one who's had to deal with these things and stand up and be counted when counting was important. Develop courage. And while sometimes when we're called on to have courage, we may not see what the end game is. In church history, we see what the end was. An expression that was developed during the years from the end of the lifetime of the apostles up until Christianity became legal in the Roman Empire. It developed in the Christian community an expression that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. They discovered that every time they went through another persecution, and they went through about 11 of them in a little over 200 years, the church was larger when it was over each time than it was when the persecution began. Inspiration. Warning. Sometimes you'll see brethren that say, well, what difference does it make if we just change this little thing? And I'm not saying whether we should or not, but when you go to church history, sometimes little things end up becoming big things. As if you go look at it from one perspective, if you're pessimistic, you say it's like the camel's nose under the edge of the tent. Next thing you know, the camel's in the bed with you in the tent, because things just keep progressing. And yet, warning's the other way too. What happened when the lines were drawn where maybe they shouldn't have been? And divisions take place. And movements that look so promising end up dying out because they kept drawing their circle of those that were approved smaller and smaller. Warning. Honesty. I want to be honest in how I not only present what happened in history, but I want to be honest with myself. And when I teach others, I want to be honest with them that not everything is easy to be explained and understood, even in the Scriptures, especially when it comes to the application of it. Okay, that's for me. That's how I think about church history. Let's think a little bit about God in history. Is God interested in history? Certainly we know in the Bible He is, isn't He? Starting with Genesis, with Adam and then his descendants, Noah, then his descendants, then Abraham and his descendants, then Jacob and his sons and their descendants, which is the nation of Israel. God was interested in that history. More than just interested in it, He was involved in it. And one of the things that the Jewish people are constantly reminded throughout the New Testament, and even we see it in the New Testament, like in Acts chapter 7, when Stephen is speaking before the Sanhedrin, before they become so angry that they murder him, is he was telling them that God has always been involved in our history, and it's us who have been the problem. Well, God's been interested in history all the way through at least the end of the New Testament. Is He still involved in history now? Now, He hasn't given us a revelation of what He's been doing since the New Testament. But I think we can be confident of this one thing. He has been involved. And if these are supposed to be God's people, as diverse and as some of them far away as they seem to be from what we read in the New Testament, is God still interested in them? And us? I think so. That's been His nature throughout the revealed part of history. That is, the part that we have revealed to us His involvement. So I have to think He still is. And I don't have the answer to how far to go with that. I don't go to the extent that some do, that almost every branch of Christianity, if you want to use the word branch, is still a part of the true church and that God is still pleased with what they're doing. I don't go that far. But neither do I restrict it to saying only members of the churches of Christ who are just like me are pleasing to God and are still His church. It's somewhere in between. But without that direct revelation, we don't know entirely when. We can have the confidence and trust and faith that He is. I do know some things that are mentioned in the Scripture that says that God was going to continue to be interested in history. Remember the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had about the great statue and then the stone cut out of the mountain across the plain as it rolled down the mountain and across the plain, kept getting bigger and bigger, and when it finally hit the feet of the great statue, its feet made out of iron and clay mixed together, that not only did the statue collapse, but then it blew away in dust, but the stone itself did what? Grew and grew until it filled the whole earth. Isn't that describing what happened after the New Testament? I think so. It's not giving us particulars, but that's a picture of the church since the New Testament from God's perspective. Other promises in the Old Testament about when the Messiah comes and sets up His kingdom, and that I'm not of the premillennial persuasion, so I believe that began on Pentecost. But it talks about how all nations will flow into it. But it also talks about how it will go out to all nations. That didn't all just happen on the day of Pentecost. It's been happening ever since. Jesus told Peter and the other disciples that He was going to build His church upon this rock, and the gates of Hades or hell will not prevail against it. The church didn't die sometime in the 2nd century. Church has never died. It's still alive. Jesus says the gates of hell, the gates of death in effect, and Satan, will not be able to prevail against it. The church still lives. It's been living ever since the New Testament. Now, different persuasions have different views of that. If you were a Baptist, especially a Southern Baptist, fundamental Baptist, they have the idea that they can find Baptist churches all the way through, in every century from then into now. I'm not going to argue with them about that, but I don't think it's limited to that, even if that's accurate. I don't know that we even have to find for ourselves the church in every one of those times. We can trust what the Scriptures themselves say, that will be the case, that the church never has died. It has never ceased to exist. Jesus promised His apostles as He was about to leave this earth, telling them at the end of Matthew about all authority has been given to me, heaven and on earth, fulfillment of what Daniel said was going to happen. Therefore, go make disciples of all nations. But then He closes that all out by saying what? And I will be with you even unto the end of the age. We're in that age. He's still with us. He's still with His people. He was with them in the 19th century, 15th century, 11th century, 7th century. He promised He would never leave His people. He's still with us today. So I think we have good reason to believe that as we study church history, at least some of what we're studying is God still at work and Christ still alive in His people. And maybe a lot more than even we could recognize. Any questions about that? Thoughts about that? All right, let me shift gears a little bit here and talk about what some of the challenges are to studying church history. The number one challenge from my perspective, and as I think about it at least, is our sources. historians, scholars do their research, write their books, and so forth from sources. They weren't there any more than we were. So they have to depend on sources. And those sources are all kinds of things. Some are written documents. Some of them might be, those documents might be official documents, such as the copies of New Testament writings that got reproduced generation after generation, the manuscripts on which modern scholars determine as best we can what the original New Testament said. But beyond that, the writings of church fathers, the other documents that were written that have survived until now, sometimes even private things. They've even found letters written between maybe a believer and an unbeliever, or an unbeliever to a believer, or even from a father to a son, that give us some little perspective on some aspect of it. Then there were early historians and chroniclers. One you often hear having to do with things in the New Testament period of time, though it doesn't affect church history very much, is a man by the name of Josephus, a Jewish historian of the first century that originally was a part of the Jewish uprising that led to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. He was a commander of some forces up in Galilee, was captured by the Romans as they were sweeping down through Galilee, headed towards Judea, and apparently he was a pretty fast talker, because they bought into the idea if they would just spare his life, then he would write a chronicle of what they were doing. They seemed to have really very little to lose in letting him do that, and he appealed somewhat perhaps to the vanity of one or more of the commanders of the Roman forces, so they allowed him to do that, and he survived and wrote not only what they did, but a lot of other things as well. But later in church history, once the church was going, in the 300s, was a man by the name of Eusebius. We'll hear more about him later. He wrote a history of the church, looking back at the first 300 years. There's other historians later who tried to do the same thing with whatever resources they had available to them. That is still a source for modern scholars to use. And of course, there's all these other things besides just the writings, monuments, practices, inscriptions, even paintings and sculptures and things like that. If you've ever seen any pictures of what's on some of the walls down in the catacombs of Rome, underneath the modern city of Rome, you know what I talk about, how they're actually recording some of their history in picture down there. But the difficulty with that is several. First of all, we don't have access, by and large, to most of those original resources ourselves. Secondly, the existence of those original resources is pretty uneven. History doesn't let later historians pick out what survives and what doesn't. So just when you'd like for something to still be existing today that was written 1,800 years ago, it doesn't. And then something else that seems totally non-valuable to our study survived. How is that possible? Why did it happen that way? Because that's just how things work, not just in church history, but in all kinds of history. And so we have this difficulty of a very unevenness about the amount of material that exists. And of course, generally speaking, the further back you go, the less is available, simply because time and wars and all sorts of other things tends to destroy things, as we're even seeing now over in that part of the world with what ISIS is doing in destroying things of great historical meaning, maybe not to us, but to other people. Now, things that have existed for 1,800 years, 2,500 years or more, future generations won't have. Well, that happens in church history too. Sometimes people wonder why that it's not until like the 300s AD suddenly there's a large number of documents of various parts of our New Testament books available. Well, a very good reason for that is that during the first 300 years, there were many times when if you owned a copy of it and you were found in possession of it, your life was forfeit. And the Romans made it their job on more than one occasion to gather up all Christian writings they could and destroy them by fire. And so it's not that those didn't exist in the earlier generations, they were destroyed. But fortunately other copies had been made before those were destroyed, so they still survive. But the proliferation really begins once the persecution is ended in the 300s. But because it is sort of uneven in what we have, and because we don't have access to the originals, we mostly have to depend upon secondary sources, what scholars and chroniclers and historians have recorded that we have access to. That's why we use a textbook. That's why you'll see on the recommended reading list other books that give you access to that. And so that's one of the challenges, is our sources of information. They're somewhat uneven, and we also have to realize when we start leaning on secondary sources, historians, scholars writing about it, as we've already said, history is not a matter just of the significant events or facts. It's also the interpretation. So you have to weigh, where is this scholar coming from? I'm listening to a podcast right now as it comes out on church history. But if you go to the website of the man that produces it, he says right off the bat, look, I'm Protestant, evangelical, Bible believing, and that's going to be the perspective from which I present my church history podcast. And yet in the comments that people are leaving on his website, you have a certain number of people that are just flaming him because his perspective is Protestant, evangelical, Bible believing. When he said right off the bat that was what it's going to be. And of course they're not. They might be Catholic, they might be Orthodox, they might be more liberal Christianity. And so they complain about that, but that's the nature of history. But we have to weigh that, When we are reading in Church History Made Easy by Dr. Timothy Paul Jones, he's Baptist. He'll tell you that up front. I'll tell you that now. That's going to let you know something about where he's coming from. He's probably going to be a little more critical of Roman Catholicism than a Catholic priest would be if he were writing this book, don't you think? He's probably going to be a little more sympathetic to Protestantism than a Catholic priest would be if he were writing this book. And truth to tell, many Catholic priests and other members of the Roman Catholicism have written very good books on various aspects and even surveys of church history. But don't expect their point of view to be the same as yours. Sometimes they're going to see what we're a part of as actually heresy. They're going to see us as the deviation from the true faith. And so you have to take that into account. That's part of the challenge of church history, is determining someone's point of view. And we've already mentioned as well, determining when something's important or not consequential. That it's not important, and so it gets overlooked, while someone else looking at the same material said, well, this is the most important thing right here. And yet someone else looking at the same thing didn't even see it of enough consequence to even mention. And that's just the nature of it. Even which part of the world you're from. The books we're going to be reading is not only being presented from, conservative, Protestant, evangelical Christianity, it's being presented from a Western culture's point of view. And by Western, I don't even mean European, I mean American. Europeans who write church history books talk about it a little differently. How do you think people who live in Africa who are writing about the history of Christianity write about it? They will really emphasize those parts of the history of Christianity that touched on Africa. Africa has a great history back in time of Christianity. If you go further east, you're talking about the Orthodox. They will see all Western Christianity as a great deviation from what they believe that real Christianity ought to be, whether it's Roman Catholic or Protestant. And they have their books too. Again, we're all dealing with the same facts and events. It's the perspective or the point of view you have as you write it. And And I'm not saying one is right or wrong, but we have to struggle with that somewhat as we look at these things. Then there's another one I often see, and that is, it's called anachronism. Anybody know what that means? I can't tell you the actual dictionary definition, but I know the practical meaning. Anachronism is when you take a modern way of thinking about something and trying to put it back upon something from another culture or another time when they didn't think about things that way at all. Some examples of that is people talk about how Christianity hundreds of years ago, or even shortly after the New Testament, how the relationship between men and women is very different than it is now. It's almost like we suddenly think we discovered the one and only right way for relationships between men and women to exist. And anybody that doesn't do that is just out of tune. Well, that's anachronism when we're trying to take what we have now come to believe, and I'm using that we generically, and try to force it back upon another time and place, another set of circumstances. And because we think we're right, then automatically we think they're wrong, and that's not fair. We see even anachronisms taking place in very close proximity to where we are now. I saw today one of the headlines on NBC News Online is some expert has predicted that so far, which is it, North Carolina, South Carolina, that passed the bathroom bill, as they're now calling it, which is an unfair way to label it. One of the Carolinas, they passed the law last year. This expert says so far it's had a negative impact of $3.7 billion on the economy of that state. But let me ask you something. 10 years ago, where was the bathroom bill? Anywhere. Nobody had such a, quote, bathroom bill. And yet, over the last just very few years, suddenly our culture has decided, a significant part of it at least, that this needs to be a part of not just our thinking, but our law. And now we're suddenly condemning people, in effect, from just 10 years ago, when everybody was there 10 years ago. Even the people who are now advocating it so strongly, they didn't even believe that 10 years ago. But that's how anachronisms work, is where you're trying to take the present thinking about something and try to look at something in the past through that thinking and condemn them and criticize them and so forth based upon that modern thinking now. And that's not fair, and it's not right either. It is a tendency of human beings in general to think that whatever we believe at this moment is the absolute truth, and everything else is error. Not just in the religious realm either. And then 20 years from now, when for whatever reason nobody believes what we believe now about it, they'll be looking back at us and thinking the same thing. A great example of that is in the area of science called evolution in all of its various forms. Whether it has to do with astrophysics or whether it has to do with biology or whatever it is, about every 20 to 25 years they have a complete turning over of the apple cart in that area of science, of evolution. And then suddenly, what everybody believed 25 years ago, only those who are considered completely out of step and ignorant are considered to believe it now, while everybody else has moved on to the next great theory. Well, again, that's anachronism, and it's not fair. We want to try as much as possible to guard ourselves against that. When we read about and hear about some of these things happening in church history, we don't want to say, well, that's wrong. It shouldn't have been that way. That's why we study church history. A little humility, a little wisdom is in order about these things. Along with that, of course, then is always to be more careful about judging the motives of other people, because we don't always know exactly what circumstances they were in, and we need to try harder to understand what led to that. Not everybody that took a misstep in church history was intending to sin against God and break His law. That was not their purpose. So many times their desire was to please Him and to do what was right. And yet they misstepped. Do we? I think we probably do too. It wasn't our intention to do that. It's not our desire to do that, but that so often happens. And so we ought to be desirous of giving them the benefit of the doubt. And along with giving them the benefit of the doubt is those who are the heirs of that way of thinking that have come on down through history. Again, we're not saying they're right, but we are trying to understand at least how they got to where they are in their thinking and be a little bit charitable about that.